Okay, so this is the last lecture. And most of the class so far has covered sort of broad topics. But for the last class, I want to talk to you about a more specific proposal, which hopefully will give you a sense of economics in action. In particular, we'll talk about, yeah, Mike. Oh, crap. In particular, this is an alternative to democracy that I've proposed in my work. And we're going to start by giving a little background on the classic impossibility results, showing even more clearly the problems with voting that we started to develop in the previous class. I'll then talk about some of the problems with previous economic alternatives to voting. I'll then discuss my quadratic voting proposal, give some basic intuition of why it works and why it takes the specific form it does. I'll then talk a little bit about robustness and the breadth with which it can be used. Then I'll talk about some of the applications of it, what I'm doing right now to try to make it a reality, and use that as a way to show you sort of what economists can do, the different roles they can play in bringing economic ideas to practice, and then I'll give a brief wrap-up of the course. Okay. So we talked about the problems with voting in the previous class, but these get much worse when there are multiple alternatives. And this was a problem that was first discussed by the Marquis de Condorcet in 1785. And he gave an example. Imagine that there's 3 candidates, A, B, and C, and 3 voters. The first voter prefers A, and then their second choice is B, and then their third choice is C. The second voter prefers B, and then their second choice is C, and their third choice is A. And the third voter prefers C, and then their second choice is A, and their third choice is B. Now, Maury, who would you consider the winner in this election? Like, who do you think is a reasonable person to choose out as a winner?
Say that any of them are, any options are winners.
Why not?
Because it's intransitive.
Uh-huh.
So, like, B would be preferred to, it would be A, I think. And then,
No, A beats B, right? Because yeah.
And then A beats B, B beats C, but C beats A.
Yes.
So
can you just explain that a little more so everybody else gets it?
Yeah, so I guess if you know that A is better than B,
yeah,
B is better than C, then A should be better than C.
Yeah.
But if you compare it there, you can tell that C is better than A.
Yeah, because there are 2 people who would vote for C over A.
Yeah.
2 people who would vote for B over C, and 2 people who would vote for A over B, right? And so there doesn't really seem to be a good reason to favor one, and this is called Condorcet's paradox of voting. Now, one way you could interpret this is that this is just a tie among candidates, and perhaps there's some coherent system that could, give you something. And many systems have been proposed in practice, like runoffs, plurality rules, etc. But in 1950, Kenneth Arrow showed that there were fundamental limits on any system where we only receive from individuals the order of preferences that they have. And to do that, he proposed some basic principles that any system should try to satisfy. In Christian, where's Christian? There he is. What were the principles that Arrow thought that any voting system should try to satisfy?
Well, one is Pareto efficiency.
Yeah.
Do you want me to explain that?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, that if one person can't be made better off without harming another person.
Yeah.
Another point is, I think, independence of alternatives.
Of irrelevant alternatives. Yes.
Irrelevant alternatives. So you can't be voting on A versus B, and then someone wants to input in an option C, that would sway the election.
Yep, that's right.
Shoot, what's the third one? I can't remember the third one.
The third one is that any preference ordering has to be admissible. Like, you can't restrict people from saying certain preference orderings. Yeah. So independent of a relevant alternative says that if we're thinking about whether A is beating B or not, the introduction of another option, C, can't change whether A beats B. Okay, so that leads to this result, which is called Arrow's general possibility theorem, which says that the only social choice rule satisfying these three principles is dictatorship. That is, that one individual always determines who wins regardless of what anyone else says. And this provides a pretty strong sense in which democracy is flawed. There's no non-dictatorial system that obeys all of these three principles. And maybe a system like having a runoff or other systems that you might think of could work better in some sense than others, but they're all in some sense going to run into this fundamental incoherence at some point. And some responded to this by saying that independence of irrelevant alternatives was too strong of a condition. That perhaps when we introduce, option C, that some people will rank C very highly, and maybe that means that they really like C and they didn't care that much about A and B, and maybe we should take that into account in determining how much weight their votes have, and therefore maybe it could change A versus B. But Gibbard and Satterthwaite proved that any system that didn't satisfy independence of irrelevant alternatives would sometimes give people an incentive to lie about their preferences. And the reason is Tavish, can you explain why if a system doesn't satisfy independence of irrelevant alternatives, it would give you an incentive sometimes to lie about your preferences?
You have an incentive, if it doesn't satisfy
independent of irrelevant alternatives, why would it give you an incentive to lie about your preferences in some occasions?
If neither of them matter to you, or sorry, I don't understand.
So imagine that the voting system that we have does not satisfy independence of irrelevant alternatives. That is, for example, sometimes we might use the fact that you rate C as your top choice to inform whether A versus B wins the election. Why would that give you an incentive to lie about your preferences?
If you do care about A versus B rather than C, then would it encourage you to vote in favor of C, even if C doesn't matter to you as much?
Yeah, so you're getting in the right direction. So imagine that we have an election where we know that A and B are going to be the most likely ones to win, but now we use the fact that you rank C first to downgrade how much weight we put on how you rate A versus B. Then that's going to give you an incentive, when you know that A and B are the only two realistic ones that could win, to not rate C first, even though C is your favorite. Okay, so Arrow's result remains true if we replace IIA with strategy proofness, which is that no matter what anyone else does, you always have an incentive to report truthfully. So this is all pretty pessimistic, right? But it relies on some very strong assumptions. Strategy proofness is a very strong assumption. It says that you never have an incentive to lie at all, regardless of anyone else says. And, at least as importantly, these systems require that people report only their ordinal preferences. Only, this is my favorite, this is my second favorite, this is my third favorite, and not how strongly they feel about different things, right? And in some sense, I think that you only reporting your ordinal preferences is sort of a fundamental feature of democracy. It says that everyone gets sort of the same amount of vote, right? It's like one man, one vote. But it's sort of a basic limitation of democracy as well. And a lot of this class is going to be about how, by relaxing the notion that you only get one person, one vote, you can do better. Okay, so a natural approach that incorporates cardinality, that incorporates how strongly you feel about issues, is the VCG mechanism. So imagine we're choosing between two alternatives, A and B. Everyone can say how much they prefer alternative A versus B or B versus A. And if you cause, as a result of your report, the total to switch from being in favor of A to being in favor of B, then you have to pay the total amount by which people other than you preferred A. Or vice versa. If you caused it to switch from B to A, then you have to pay the total amount by which other people preferred B. And unfortunately, though, some of the problems that arise in VCG, which I mentioned, I think, a little bit in class, are particularly severe in this context. Okay, so one thing that we talked about with VCG is that any money that it raises has to be destroyed rather than refunded back to people involved, right? Because otherwise, people will have an incentive to exaggerate how strongly they feel about something just to force other people to pay more, right? And that could be a pretty big problem here because this is a big collective decision taken among a large number of people. What are you going to do with the money? You can't give it to anyone. You've just got to destroy it. The second and probably more severe problem is collusion. So if any two individuals report an overwhelming preference for A over B, then each one of them individually would have guaranteed that A wins. And that would in turn guarantee that neither of them have to make any payments. Why is that? Because once A is winning, then they're not pivotal. They're not changing the decision. And therefore, they don't have to make any payments. Yeah, Bart.
Suppose there was like a lot of people, and so like everybody would have an incentive to do that, right? So wouldn't that like kind of offset it in some sense?
Well, I mean, it would sort of turn into chaos, right? Like, I don't know what the equilibrium would be at that point. You know what I mean? It might be something very crazy. I mean, I just don't know, right? No one's ever studied that as far as I know. So what that means is that this system is like incredibly sensitive to collusion. So Hal Varian, the author of your textbook, told me a story of when he was giving a class like this at Michigan and trying to teach people about VCG. He ran one of these things where they did the VCG mechanism to determine the date of the final exam. And most people were like, oh, it's worth $2 to me this day, $3 to me that day, whatever. And then one girl said, oh, it's worth $1,000 to me to have it on this day. And then Hal was like, really? It's worth $1,000? She's like, oh, yeah, I have this incredible commitment. It's worth $1,000 to me. And then the next girl sitting next to her, who was her best friend, said, oh, yeah, it's worth $1,000 to me to have it on that day as well. Right. And so obviously they'd figured out the collusive attack against VCG, right? So as a result of this, most people think VCG is sort of hopelessly impractical. But one thing to notice, remember when we looked at the VCG payments that you had to make? Remember that if, rather than being a binary decision, it was one of these continuous decisions where we were saying how much of an externality to create, when if this is the cost to everyone else and this is the cost to you, if we add those up, the amount that you end up paying is this Harburger triangle, which is quadratic in the amount by which you shift the decision. And that was the basis, when I sort of realized that, that was the basis for an alternative mechanism that we're going to spend most of today's class discussing. And this is called quadratic voting. And with a binary decision, it takes a very simple form. Philip, what is quadratic voting on a binary decision? How does it work?
Well, the poller calls out, like, you may buy vote, positive or negative votes, and the cost of your votes is proportional to the square of the number of votes you request. And then they'll add up all the votes and implement the side that gets more.
Yep. And then the money gets refunded back to people so that the budget is balanced, right? So this basically, by this logic here, like VCG, makes everyone pay their externality, but it does so in a way that is much less complicated in some sense, and which is sort of self-estimated rather than being estimated based on what everybody else says, in much the same way that a first price auction, you end up paying the amount that you sort of think the next guy is going to pay, right? Because you're just trying just to beat him. But you're doing that calculation rather than him telling the auctioneer what it will be. And as a result of that, it's not as subject to these collusive problems. It also avoids the revenue problem. You don't have to destroy the revenue, you can give it back to people. Yeah, Philip?
How come that there isn't a severe problem with perverse incentives with the revenues in quadratic voting?
Because what created the revenue incentive problem was the fact that what you say determines how much other people pay. But here, it's what you say determines only what you pay. And so that problem doesn't arise. So the source of the collusion problem and of the revenue problem is the same. It's that other people are determining what each person pays. Yeah, Mike?
I have a question about the refunding.
Yeah.
If you have like a quadratic vote over a bunch of outcomes,
Yeah.
Is the redistribution only to the people who, and then like one outcome wins, but like a few people voted for that one?
Yeah.
Is the redistribution to everybody, or just like the people besides the person who cast the highest vote, or to everybody who didn't vote for that outcome?
It's in any redistribution is done in any way such that everyone gets back the same fraction of the money they themselves put in. So there's a million different ways that would have that. So like one way I could do that is that Tanner gets the money that you paid, Adam gets the money that Tanner paid, etc. I could have a system like that. I could have everybody get 1 over n of what everybody puts in. I could have people get some share of what everyone other than them puts in, but then 1 over n of what they put in. I mean, there's like a million different ways.
Okay. We were talking about
yeah.
like a quadratic vote
Yeah.
with a few people from this class yesterday, and
Yeah.
like if you're picking from a bunch of restaurants to go to,
Yeah.
and there's one that like everybody clearly hates and would not be picked, then could somebody cast like a very small vote on that restaurant, and then just like with the intention of getting money redistributed?
Oh, no. Whenever you take the vote, it has to, like, they can't get back. You have to pool all the money from the entire vote that you do together, and then you have to redistribute that stuff back in a way so that people get a constant fraction of the total amount that they paid in. But 1 over n would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So, do you know how multi-option quadratic voting works? That wasn't described as much in the paper, was it?
We were just trying to...
You were trying to figure it out.
No.
Well, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but just to answer the question now, the way that it works is you choose one option to be the default option, and then for all the options that are not the default option, everyone's allowed to buy votes in favor of or against those options. And then if all options have, other than the default, have negative votes, the default wins. And if any option has positive votes, then whichever has most positive votes wins. Okay. So, quadratic voting has many attractive features, and I'll just give sort of a glimpse of this today. I'll give some more intuition about why it works, why quadratic exactly, and then I'll talk about robustness along many dimensions like collusion as well as applications. Okay. So I want to try to keep the math to a minimum in this lecture, so I'm just going to focus on intuitions. Let's let the utility that an individual gets in units of dollars from an outcome be UI. which may be positive or negative. They're either in favor of implementing the alternative to the status quo or negative if they're against. And the other crucial quantity is the chance that one vote changes the outcome. And the key idea is that in a large group of people, this chance that one vote changes the outcome will not vary very much with the number of votes that you buy. So the idea is that, if you think about Bush winning by 400 votes or Gore winning by 400 votes, these were basically like the same events up to hanging chads, right? They were all like the vote that the election is roughly tied, right? There's really no way to tell the difference between these different things. And in this sense, it's like a market price. It's something that doesn't vary much with the behavior of any individual person, and that's why the mechanism works. It works very much like a market. Only large individuals will have market power and cause problems. And we're going to denote this number, this chance of a tie, the density of pivotality by P, both because it's for pivotality and because it looks like a price. Together, this utility that you get and the chance that an additional vote changes the election outcome determines the marginal utility that you get from buying an additional vote. Can someone say what that is? Is Wesley here? Yeah, Wesley. Yeah, I think.
Well,
Look up. What is the marginal utility that you get from buying an additional vote? If P is the chance that that vote changes the election outcome, and UI is the utility that you get from the election going one way or the other.
Okay, then I guess it would just be the product of the two.
Yeah, it's P times U, right? And what's the marginal cost of an additional vote, Kim? The price of votes is the square of the number of votes you buy. So what's the marginal cost of a vote?
To the
Yeah, exactly. So Dake, can you tell us what the first order condition then is going to be for the optimal number of votes to buy?
Well, then you would set the marginal cost of the vote to the marginal utility benefit of the vote.
Yep.
So you set 2VI to P times UI. So then VI equals P over 2 times UI.
Exactly. So notice that this is efficiency. Why is this efficiency? Because everyone buys votes in proportion to how much they care about the issue. So let me give just a numerical illustration. So imagine that you're deciding whether to go out to dinner using your dorm's budget. And person X is $60 in favor of doing this. And people Y and Z are $20 and $10 against it. So imagine that the chance that one additional vote changes the outcome is 1/10. Wesley, then what are going to be the purchases of votes by each of these individuals?
All right. And so P is 1 cent. So P over 2 is 1 over 20.
Yeah.
So for X would be 3.
He'll buy 3 votes, yeah?
Yeah. Y would buy 1. And Z would buy.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Though I actually got this wrong because I forgot to divide by 2.
Okay.
But,
You
so,
buy half of a vote.
what?
You buy half.
Yeah, you can buy a continuous number of votes. Okay. And what are going to be the payments associated with that? Anybody? There we go.
You're just squaring everything. So
Yep.
X buys 3, that's $9.
Dollars, yeah.
Or sorry, $9, and then 1.5 become $1 and 0.25.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, this is wrong again. So then each of them is going to get 1025 divided by 3 equals roughly like 350 or something like that back. And notice that, okay, so this isn't quite right in this case. So they get 350 back. So Y and Z are going to be worse off. X is going to be better off, but at least they get $3.50 back to compensate them for the fact that they don't get things in the direction. And if you scaled things slightly differently, as I had done here, if it had been a 1 in 5 chance, for example, then it actually would have been that Y would have been worse off, but Z actually would have been would have been better off than under democracy, even though she loses because she gets the money back. This is what Philip was saying earlier about redistribution of the flex dollars to the people who value them the most, right? So overall, this is a social gain because the person who cared the most got it and the losers were compensated, except for people who were losers and were relatively extreme because they make larger payments. Yeah, Tanner?
How do you calculate the pivotality?
Pivotality chance?
Yeah.
Well, you have to figure out what the distribution of values that people could have is, and then there's a computation that you basically do. There's a formula that's in the paper that gives you like an approximation to what that will be. Yeah, Dave?
Doesn't this still play right back into the issue that Mike brought up not too long ago about compensation? Because theoretically, if someone were to quote unquote buy into this decision with like a penny, but then they get compensated back.
Yes, you have to decide the set of people who are allowed to participate separately from like how much they're actually going to participate, conditional on them participating.
Okay.
So you have to like basically figure out, like based on your ex ante sense, like is everyone roughly equal? Are there some people who are like more important to this decision? You can give them back a bigger share of the revenues that come back.
Like in like a practical sense, if you have like with companies in the paper that we read for today, since the value is returned through like kind of indirectly through the shares.
Yeah. So then it's proportional to the shares.
Okay.
That's it. Yeah, Bart.
If pivotality approaches 0 as the number of people increases,
It does. Yeah.
doesn't that have the same sort of issue with like you don't have an incentive to vote?
That would be true. You currently don't have an incentive to vote right now. I'll talk a little bit later about why people actually do vote, and if people continue to vote more than the model suggests for those reasons, that's actually fine, as long as they sort of like upweight how much they vote by in proportion to their utility, right? That'll still lead to the same thing. In fact, it actually leads it to be more efficient, it turns out. So, yes, Joel?
So depending like what people know about everybody else, even if it's a really large market,
Yeah.
couldn't people have different pivotalities or like be aware that they have different pivotalities?
So in a large market, under most conditions they won't. Under some conditions they will. So we'll talk a lot about stuff like that. But as the number of people gets large, under most conditions, it will converge to it being the same for everybody. But there are some conditions under which it won't. Usually it's not very far off, and so you get very close to full efficiency, much closer than you do under voting. But yeah. Joan?
So if people calculate their pivotality, that means before they participate, they should have a sense of how many people are participating.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Oh yeah, Philip?
It was, in practice, it's pretty difficult for people to calculate these values, at least from some of the experimental evidence, right?
Maybe, or, in first price auctions, people usually do a pretty good job guessing what, the next highest person's going to bid. They behave not too far off from equilibrium. The hope would be you could do something similar here. But of course, when you have, a really high stakes situation and people are really uncertain about what's going on, you'd prefer to have some more, open auction that helps people get a sense for what's going on. And you could do that here as well, because you could have everyone, report in how much they value the thing, and then the computer could estimate, as I was saying with Tanner, based on that, what's the density of pivotality, and then could tell people advice about what they should do. And you could do rounds of that, and it would be like an auction. You would have a posted density of pivotality, And like as people change their values, the computer would be constantly re-estimating the chance of being pivotal, and so you could do a system like that. Oh, yeah, Tanner.
But since that would also involve people reporting, self-reporting values, would that be open? Would that be have the same problem?
Well, because not any one individual will have much of it's similar like to running an auction, right? In an auction, you could like bid wrongly to try to move the price, but if there's a large number of people, you can't move the price much by the way you bid, and so you have more of an incentive to like just avoid getting caught on the wrong side of the price than you do to try to manipulate the price. So, okay. So you might ask why we use the quadratic rule in particular. And to think about this, let's consider let's consider an alternative rule where you pay not the square of the number of votes you buy, but the number of votes you buy to the power x. And I'm being a little sloppy here because, of course, this can hide or not hide the sign, depending on whether the power x is odd or even. But what I really mean by this is you pay the absolute value of the number of votes you buy to the power of x. Okay. So then the marginal benefit you get from buying an additional vote is still p times u, but the cost is now x times v to the x minus 1. And so then, can somebody tell me what the what the optimal number of votes for people to buy is going to be then? Yeah.
Well, you'd use the same method. You set the marginal cost to the marginal benefit. So
Yeah.
it would be pu equals x times v to the x minus 1.
Yeah.
So to figure out what v is, you divide pu by x.
Yeah.
So then you have p over x times u, and then you would power both sides by 1 over 1 minus,
X minus
1
1.
over x minus 1.
Yeah, so ignoring the constants there, everyone's going to buy votes in proportion to u to the x 1 over x minus 1 power. And that means that the decision is not going to be based on the sum of people's utilities, but the sum of their utilities to the power 1 over x minus 1, which is efficient if and only if x is equal to 2, right? If x is less than 2, you're going to put too much weight on the extremists, the people with very strong opinions, because you'll do a convex transformation of utility. So people with very extreme utilities will get a higher weight than people with small utilities. If x is greater than 2, you put too little weight on the extremes, and therefore you reduce the amount that you care about the intensity of people's preferences. Okay, so in fact we can relate this to other forms of government by changing x, right? So as x approaches infinity, everyone is going to buy exactly one vote. Why is that? Can someone explain that? Yeah, so.
Yeah, like the exponent of 1 over x minus 1 is going to go to 0.
Yep.
So that u0 is just 1 instead of
Exactly. So this goes to majority rules democracy, right? Because it's one man, one vote then. On the other hand, as x goes to 1 and we get towards linear vote buying, what's going to happen? Yeah, Rishi.
Question on the previous part, on the previous question.
Yeah?
As x goes to infinity, wouldn't the value go to k? Because you'd have u.
Yeah, but I mean the point is it's equal number of votes. I mean it doesn't matter what the number of votes people have
So it's
as long
just
as
like the set constant.
Yeah, Dave?
Oh.
Yeah, answer it, yeah.
Well, if x goes to 1, then it would just go to 1 over 1 over 1, well, 1 over 0, sorry.
Yeah.
So then it would become the u to the infinity, which means that you would have an infinite amount of votes depending on, people would just buy infinite amounts of votes depending on read.
Well, in particular, the ratio between the number of votes bought by someone who has a slightly higher utility to someone who has a slightly lower would go to infinity. And so that means that the person with the most intense preference would buy infinitely more than the person with even slightly less, and therefore that you'll have dictatorship of the individual with the most intense preference. The reason intuitively for that is that when you have linear voting, it's like an auction. The person who's willing to pay the most will buy infinitely more votes than the person who's willing to pay even a little bit less. So basically you auction off the country to the highest bidder. Yeah, Right.
Could that happen with the VCG mechanism as well? Like if there's...
No, because everyone there will buy as a unilateral incentive, at least weekly, to buy things exactly equal to how much they care, and you add that up.
Under the assumption that everybody's colluding.
Oh, under the assumption that people are colluding, that could well happen. I mean, I'm not completely sure. I haven't thought through enough what the equilibrium when people collude looks like there. You have to specify exactly what you mean by what collusive groups form. So, and systems in between can be thought of as intermediate values of x. So like x, if x equals 1 is dictatorship and x equals infinity is democracy, oligarchy is sort of like x between 1 and 2, and republics are sort of like x between 2 and infinity. And since Aristotle's time, we've been debating between these different forms of government, but we didn't have some coherent spectrum on which to put them, and therefore it was hard to figure out sort of what the optimum was. And I think this way of looking at things makes clear that the optimal point is when there's 2. And in fact, in different parts of our political system, we use different values of x effectively. We have majority rules voting determining many things, but we also have lobbying and campaign contributions and money in politics that essentially auctions things to the highest bidder in some cases. So there we're using x closer to 1. But the optimum is in as many areas as possible to make x equal to 2. Okay. Now, of course, my main criticism of the VCG mechanism was that it was very sensitive to collusion. And so a natural question is how sensitive QV is to collusion. Tavish, can you think of a reason why people would want to collude in QV? What would be the benefit to them of colluding under QV?
For some purpose beyond just getting what they want.
Well, I mean, like, can they benefit from colluding? Is it collusion-proof? Are there benefits to colluding?
Again, I can't think of a specific way that
Okay.
they could collude.
Evan?
Well, it becomes cheaper.
How so?
Well, I mean, so the way I'm thinking about it is suppose you buy K times 2n votes,
Yeah.
or spend that much dollars, you get square root of that votes, or square root of K times 2n dollars. But suppose that instead you divvy up the money so that K number of people each buy 2n votes, then you get spend 2n dollars, then you get K times square root of 2n votes.
Yeah.
And so it's increased by a factor of square root of K.
Yeah, that's basically right. So, I mean, there are two ways of... Okay, so there's two different types of collusion. Imagine that one person is in favor of something and another person is against, and they offset each other. They could just make an agreement that neither of them will buy anything, and then they save the money, right? So that's one way that you could collude. But that's not going to impact efficiency, right? Because that's just canceling out two people who would have canceled out anyways. It's only affecting how much revenues are raised. But what Evan is suggesting is something that's more dangerous to efficiency. And let me put it in a slightly different way than Evan did. Imagine that we're both opposed to something. We both wish the other person would buy more votes than they're buying. So if we collude, we'll both buy more votes in the direction that we both feel than we would otherwise. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, Julian.
One person would buy more and one person would buy less, so the total amount.
No, that's not true. Because we both gain on the margin from the other person buying more votes. Right? And once we take that into account, we'll both buy more. Another way of stating that is what Evan said, which is that if you pool our utilities together, now the cost of buying votes is effectively lower because we can spread it over the two people, and therefore we only have to pay like 1 over m of the cost that we'd have to pay if we bought it completely separately. Yeah.
But then wouldn't you have like free rider problems if you had two people and they're both voting in the same favor, one was voting a lot more than the other one? They wouldn't want to, like, why would you want to increase their votes? Because one person would be like free riding off like the other person.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So under linear contributions to a public good, we have the free rider problem. But if you have quadratic payments for contributions to a public good, there is no free rider problem. It exactly offsets the free rider problem. And so as a result of that, if people then try to solve the free rider problem, that actually hurts us. So like before we had to get around the fact that like under linear contributions we had a free rider problem, we needed to get people to collude. Here now it's actually harmful that people are colluding because we've moved to a market system where we've offset fully the free rider problem. So like here's another way of thinking about it. If we have a system where you make linear contributions, then having like one person broken up into multiple people is really bad because there's a free rider problem. If contributions were like every person gets to make $1 of contribution, well then you'd want to be split up into as many people as you possibly can. And quadratic is the point in between those two extremes where those two effects exactly cancel each other out.
Like with the example you gave where you have like two people, they both voting in favor of the same thing.
Yeah.
If they talk to each other, if they both decide, like, if they both find out they're voting
Yeah.
in favor of the same thing, wouldn't one guy say like, well, I mean, that other guy's gonna vote for it, so like, I don't have to vote as much, like, I'm less pivotal, the other guy thinks.
Well, so first of all, they won't affect that much how pivotal they are, but yeah, they would have an incentive to defect from the collusive agreement, just like every collusive agreement creates incentives to defect, just like we studied. Yeah. So, yeah.
What about if someone pays like a person who's relatively different, say they don't really care, so I'll pay you $3 to make a couple votes. So you like spread out your costs among all these people, which will lower the total cost. So even if you bribe these people to make votes for you.
Yeah, so those are people who don't care at all, who are sort of weakly in this direction. So it's a combination of the two effects, right? Some of the benefit that you get from that is you get a cheaper way of getting the same number of votes, but another incentive is because it's cheaper to buy votes, you might buy more. So both of those effects will come into play in that case.
So would that be very bad for the system?
It would be, yeah. So that's exactly the collusion problem we were talking about with Evan. Yeah. Okay, so let me actually go through an example just like the one Tanner said. So imagine that Romney wants to buy the presidency, and he has $100,000 to do that. Like that's his wealth. How many votes would he be able to buy on his own, Andrew?
10,000.
10,000, right? Now, note that that's not going to do him all that much good. Probably doesn't even do him as much good as what he did through his advertising, right? Because he only gets 10,000 votes, and that's if everybody else spent on average $1, that would be less than 0.01% of the total vote in the U.S., right? Now imagine he can get 100 friends who otherwise wouldn't have spent anything to take each of his those $1 million. They could each buy 1,000 votes, and how many votes would that translate into in total, Julian?
So that would be 100,000 votes.
Yeah, exactly. But still, that's only 0.1% of the total vote, and each one of those friends would have like a giant temptation not to spend those $1 million on that, but instead to just pocket the money and say, "Oh, sorry, you didn't win, but It's also would be very easy to get caught. Because not only would those people have a temptation to run off with those $1 million, but not only could they run off with it, but they could also report it to the government. The government would be like, well, if you were asked to be part of a collusive scheme, report it to us, and then we'll give you an extra $1 million as a reward, right? Or Mitt Romney could pretend to be 100 people, right? But obviously that would be a pretty dangerous thing for him to do. Yeah, Dave?
But, I mean, in this particular practical situation,
yeah.
If you were to just issue like $5 to every like hardcore Republican voter, I don't think the typical Republican voter, they would want to vote for Romney.
Yeah, but the thing is, they would want to vote for Romney the same amount that they wanted to vote for Romney before they got those $5.
it just seems to me that that makes sense in the theoretical sense, but practically speaking, I feel like I could easily imagine a scenario in which they just gave out $5 and at like the campaign, like at the voting poll, and then they just.
Well, I mean, they could do that right now. So like they could go around to everyone to get out the vote, and they could just pay the money for no reason. Just say, oh, here's some money. You know what I mean? And there's still lots of people who don't vote. I mean, if they were doing it on a massive scale like that, it would be at least as easy to catch as vote buying is right now, right? So, yeah, Tanner.
What about if the voting was public? Because there's plenty of times, like in the paper, you brought up U.S. Congress, if they did some like QBB for that,
Yeah.
where it's easy to know if someone actually does
Yeah.
follow through when you buy their vote. How
So
would you stop?
then it's definitely harder to stop collusion, just as right now it's harder to stop like the bargaining in Congress from corrupting things, right? You know, you'd have to try to police that in other ways through norms that it was like really dirty or unethical to do stuff like that. But okay, so the other thing is that it's not just detection by authorities that can cause problems for this, but if other people know that you're buying votes, that actually creates incentives for them to offset what you're doing, so then it can become self-defeating. Because like if they know that your side is likely to win now, then they're going to go against that. Okay, so there's many other issues of robustness here. Yeah, Philip.
But if you convince them that you've established an extremely strong position and they can't take it down on their own, might they just give up because their density of pivotality falls to close to zero?
No, so the opposite actually happens, because all the other people that are on your side also have their density of pivotality that falls to zero.
I see.
And you have your density of pivotality falling to zero, so you don't even want to buy that many. And you see what starts to happen. Yeah, so that's actually always against your interest. You always want to convince people that they're likely to win. Okay, but let me breeze through a few different things. So there's a question of how many people do you need for things to actually be small, and you can calculate this stuff, and it's done in the paper. I won't go through that. What if people overestimate? This should be P, not G. Like, what if they think that they're more likely to be pivotal than they are? Like, maybe that helps explain why people vote under our current system, even though it takes some of their time. This actually raises efficiency because it makes it more likely that it makes it more. Okay, so if you look at like what happens is like the number of people gets large. The problem is there might be someone who's like really opposed to the thing who like buys out everyone else. And because everybody else doesn't think a tie is very likely, there's not enough of them to overrule him. But if they think the tie is very likely, then that can't happen. And so it actually makes the system more efficient. Yeah, Austin.
Are there any systemic papers that have been published on trying to establish whether it is kind of overestimating the pivotality?
Yes, there's a huge literature on that. There's also other reasons, like people just want to express themselves through their vote. They want to like say like I'm in favor of this person. That also aids efficiency. We went through like sort of almost all the models that like are typically used to explain this, and they all like actually make it work at least as well, if not better. Okay. Another possibility is that rather than people differing in their preferences, they might all have the same interests. Like we might all want have equal shares in a company and want the company to do well, but different people might have different information. And the nice thing about quadratic voting in that context is, unlike standard voting, where like all you can do is say yes, no, or abstain. Here you can say, well, I know a little bit in this direction, but I don't want my vote to have too much weight. I want to defer to other people, right? And so this lets you do that. This does better in terms of incentives to acquire information as well. So you won't necessarily acquire enough information for the same way as in intellectual property, because if it benefits other people, that information, like if it doesn't affect only your payoff, but it affects other people's payoffs, you don't have enough incentive to acquire information. But it does give you the right incentives to acquire information about your own preferences. There's also the possibility that people don't know what P is, because there might be uncertainty about like overall how do people feel about this issue, and this can lead to some inefficiency, but it still almost always does better than democracy And polling and communication can help give people a sense of what P is and restore more complete efficiency. Okay. So there are alternative versions of this that you can do, such as you don't need to use real money. You can use fake money. You can extend things beyond binary choices. And you can help people figure out what P is. And let me talk about some of those extensions. So as I mentioned earlier, if you want to decide between multiple alternatives, the right way to do it is to have one default choice, and then the other choices you can buy votes in favor of or against. You can even allow people to nominate things. And the way that they do that is they commit some of their money to buy votes, and if you get enough total votes together, then the issue gets put onto the ballot, and then your money is committed to it once you've done that, and that keeps people from, as some people were mentioning, putting up frivolous votes just to get redistribution back to them. Yeah, Julian.
Doesn't that undervalue the people who are trying to push the issue? Because they have to spend time to get other people to like even learn about the issue and collect the money.
But I mean, it's also costly on other people to have to consider the issue, and so that's what they're being forced to pay for, basically. So there are versions without actual cash, because you can, if there are multiple decisions or multiple choices within a decision, then people can make trade-offs between those different things, and so you can give people artificial currency that they can spread across those different decisions. So that's one thing you guys might want to do if you're running into resistance to using actual money, is if you have multiple decisions, you can give people some tokens, and then they can spend it on the different decisions. Or even if there's only one decision to be made, if you have multiple options, then you can give it to spend on the different options. Rishi.
When you say multiple decisions, you mean like the multiple decisions across time, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's not just channeling all their money.
Yeah, exactly. But even if you have like 3 options, like there's 3 different restaurants you're gonna go to, you can give people currency and they can spread those across the 2 different alternatives to the status quo. Okay. You can also give guidance to voters on P. So you could have everyone simultaneously report in their values, and then you could have like a value of P that's being estimated by the computer, and it could fluctuate around as people buy more or less votes. As P rises, people will buy more votes, but then the chance that anyone's pivotal will go down, and it will equilibrate at the right value of P. So it's sort of like a market, right? Like if there's more demand, the price goes up. If there's less demand, the price goes down. Yeah, Kristen.
Wouldn't this kind of guiding voters to the computer encourage collusion up to the point of actually buying votes, like unreporting?
Well, but the thing is, it's just like an auction. Like, people won't want to do that very much because they are worried that the auction might at any point end, and then they're going to get stuck looking like an idiot. You see what I mean? Okay. Yeah.
Like during the simulation, they're not actually putting in any money, right? So.
No, they are. What they're at every point saying is like, here's what they say, here's how much I care about the issue. And then the computer will automatically, given the value of P, make you vote P times that. You see what I mean? Okay. So the easiest applications in the short term will be, I think, in the private sector. So some examples of this, there's a group of students led by a student who took this class last year, Jacob Rabinowitz. I don't know if anyone knows him. And they're designing one that uses fake currency for the mobile app challenge. Do you guys know what the mobile app challenge is? Yeah, so they're submitting an application to that will be for committees using fake currency, deciding on things like awarding honors to students, hiring, scheduling meetings, etc. Other applications like this are book groups or clubs. Another application that we're exploring is startup companies, like within the company, deciding on amenities or investments that they're going to make. Corporate governance is another application. So remember we talked about all these minority shareholder protections in one of the first classes. And those were like using very particular rules, like if you get above 15% of shares, then you need to like declare that, and then other people can vote against you at a lower cost or whatever. Here you have a very simple system for downweighting large shareholders that can avoid them exploiting other people, which is everyone just gets to vote the square root of the number of shares that they have. So on the one hand, you guys, when you try to use this with your friends, might run into objections that, oh, it's unfair that someone with more money should have more say. But you get the opposite objection in corporate governance, which is people say, oh, it's unfair that someone who has 20% of the shares shouldn't get 20% of the votes. Shouldn't they have something exactly in proportion to how much money they have? Well, no, they should get the square root. So in both cases, we get objections, but coming from opposite directions, because everyone's used to the conventional system and not used to this deviation from it. Okay, so actually this is a big issue in Korea because there are these families that control these companies, even though they don't have that much of a actual ownership stake. They have a much larger voting stake, and they do that by having 51% of a company that has 51% of a company that has 51% of a company that owns this, the final company, right? And they use that to suck all the profits out of the company by forcing it to buy very expensive services from a company that they own 100% of. And as a result of that, they want some way to try to reduce the power of these large holders. And what I proposed was using this quadratic voting system or square root voting as an alternative. And I actually presented in front of the Korean National Assembly when I was there. But I think actually the most exciting applications are in the public sector. So for example, remember when we talked about eminent domain and complements assembly? Well, a natural system would be to have people buy votes on whether to accept an offer that's made to them by the government to buy out their land. And that is much more efficient and ensures that no one ever gets their land bought out for less than it's worth in total to the people who it's bought from. International institutions right now are a total disaster, I think, as we've seen through the Syria events and so forth, right? Because there are all these tiny little countries that can paralyze the institution. But on the other hand, when there's an issue that's really relevant to one of those countries, like Israel or something like that, then they can trample all over those countries' sovereignty. If countries could, by paying into the operations of the organization, buy votes according to the square root, this would be much more efficient than the way that it currently runs, which is that the U.S. goes around and offers military aid to all the countries that vote with it in the UN, which is probably much less efficient than just funding the UN's operations using the purchases of votes, right? Representative bodies could work this way too. Currently, Congress used to have all these systems of, pork barrel spending to buy off somebody else in order to get a bill passed. And, that was done away with by the bans on earmarks. But I think a lot of people think that's made Congress work a lot less efficiently. And if you've seen the movie Lincoln, you know that those buying of votes from different people is actually important to get legislation through. And if people could actually just use money from their districts directly in paying out of that into some account, that would probably be more efficient. Eventually, you could even use this for referenda and elections directly, either with money or without money. And I know that a lot of people would object to you having, the rich have more sway in elections. But I think that a lot of that comes out of mistaking linear vote buying for quadratic vote buying. Because as we saw with Romney, he could buy very few votes with all of his money once you have the quadratic rule. And I think more broadly, as we talked about when we were doing cost-benefit analysis and so forth, it's not clear why we should wall off public decisions from the influence of money that we have in private decisions. That's not efficient because it basically forces poor people to have crappy schools, bad health care, but have equal say on whether abortion is legal or not. It doesn't seem like that's in anybody's interest. If you could make payments to people that would allow them to live better lives but have less influence, say, on social issues, that would probably be better for everybody. And in fact, I think money might well have less influence in some ways, because right now you can linearly buy campaign ads that sway basically indifferent people. Whereas that wouldn't be as valuable under the system, because if the people remained indifferent, they wouldn't be willing to put their money in and be swayed by those stupid ads, right? So as a result of this, I hope that in the long term, this system could transform the way that a lot of different social organizations work. But in order to do that, we need to experiment a lot with it. We need to figure out what, how people relate to it, what's the easiest way to get people to understand it. Yeah, Evan.
How exactly does this work against advertisements? So what if there's a particularly good advertisement and it sways 15 different people to go out and buy votes?
Well, I think that the thing is that if you get them to buy just a tiny amount, right, it won't have much of an effect. So ads that are meant to appeal to sort of like ignorant and not, like people who don't really care at all, are not going to have much effect. On the other end, really good ads that genuinely provide really important information and really change seriously how much people care about something will have an effect, but they should. So that's the point. Yeah, Austin.
What about like invariance of like how much people are willing to pay? Like I know how we talked with survey mechanisms, people always tend to go towards like $20 for instance.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that tend to have an impact? Wouldn't that tend to suggest that maybe people wouldn't pick, very, very small numbers?
Well, I think that in surveys, people usually aren't meant to put real money on the line. And we do have a lot of evidence that when real money is on the line, people are less subject to those types of effects. So I think that's the problem with contingent valuation. Yeah, Christian.
This might be out of kind of left field, but
Yeah.
could the quadratic buying be used in other applications, like for example, buying campaign ads? I know they're already heavily
Yeah,
weighted.
absolutely.
That would make minorities more-
So here's an alternative way to do that. So imagine that, okay, so right now, like, everyone thinks that the wealthy have too much influence on campaign ads that exist, and that the poor have too little influence. And sometimes people propose public funding of campaigns, as a partial solution to that. So here's a really simple way that gives voice to people over who gets to have what campaign ad, but also is like more egalitarian. So imagine the government puts in a bunch of money, and we have some multiplier where, like, if you pay X dollars, X, the square root of X times K dollars is donated to your political campaign. So then the rich could put more in, but it would be very, very expensive for them to do it. And the poor could put in, but it would be very cheap for them to do it, because they would, be spending a very small amount and would be multiplied by some big amount. And to make the budget balance, you would take whatever money comes out of the public treasury to subsidize the system. And in fact, that's a more general way of doing this. So like if Bill Gates wanted to like contribute to charities, but wanted to give, harness the wisdom of crowds, he could say, here, I'm going to give this money, and I'm going to make up the difference between the square root times K and like the actual amount of money that people put in. And that would be like an efficient way to figure out what the right charities are to give to. Okay, so we think that we need to start with the small applications, learn from those, and build out from there. And as a result, Eric Posner and I have started a company that's trying to develop software to do this. It's called Collective Decision Engines. And some undergrads, as I mentioned, have been very involved in the development of this. The basic ideas behind it are public, but the implementation will be proprietary. And the problem set has you sort of play with working on this to try to help us out a little bit. We plan to use this to, learn and improve. So please give us, feedback, and I'm looking forward to seeing your solutions on the problem set. And this will help us tailor things to application. Sorry, if we succeed, we're going to try to tailor the system to particular applications that will allow us to bring in some revenue and thereby continue to improve the system, market it, and increase the level of ambition that we go for. Okay, so I think that this is one example of how economics can change your thinking about issues. The course tries to be sort of a back and forth between economic paradigms and real-world applications of them. And let me try to remind you of some of the breadth of things that we covered. We talked about some of the surprising dynamics of drug markets. We talked about incentive schemes in managing organizations, about optimal carbon taxation, the regulation of the insurance industry, the design of auctions and criminal justice, solutions to complementary goods assembly and holdout problems in eminent domain. We talked about innovation policy, merger control, income taxation, new ways of collective decision making. And in all of these areas, I hope that you guys now have something interesting and different to say from an economic perspective that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise about what optimal policy should be on all these types of questions. We also tried to explore some fundamental trade-offs about which I hope you now have more of a nuanced and less ideological understanding. We tried to think about, disaggregating some of the differences between, quote, capitalism and, quote, socialism, such as the trade-off between internalizing externalities and providing public goods, that on the one hand, there are distortions from ignoring those externalities, but standard political systems are very flawed ways of making decisions about those, and so that creates a really big trade-off. Redistributing income is beneficial because it provides social insurance, but it can reduce incentives of people to work. Instituting regulations that eliminate the distortions of market power or providing prizes in lieu of patents can be beneficial, but it also requires the government to have a lot of information that might not be available. Competition policy can reduce market powers of cartels, but it can also eliminate economies of scale and perhaps get in the way of innovation and creative destruction. So not all of these issues are the same, and they depend on different parameters in different settings that are adapted to different circumstances. And so I hope, rather than just having an ideology in one direction or the other, you guys will come to have had a more nuanced sense of each of these issues, and that this will allow you to combine in your person both the character of the expert that we talked about and of the voter, and thereby help make you more informed participants in many ways in a wide variety of social issues. And I think this brings us sort of to the end of the course and what this all means to you. And let me just tell you a little bit about my story and how I got interested in economics, because maybe it'll mean something in this context. So I worked at a hedge fund during the summer of 2005, which was sort of at the height of the boom in the financial industry. And we developed a trading strategy that made a lot of money, but seemed, for reasons that you guys sort of explored during the class, actually socially destructive to me. And I asked my boss, what was the value for which we had been rewarded with whatever, $200 million? And he said, ours is not to question why, ours is just to do and die. And so that day, I had dinner with the person who became my advisor, who was my teacher in my one of my economics courses. And I told him the story, and he said, look, if you become an economist, your job will be to question why. And that's why I decided to become an economist. And the way I think about it is that society is like a giant machine, and there's lots of people who have to work very hard just to keep one of the parts of the machine turning. But we need, and because we're such a wealthy society now, we can now afford to have somebody who has, some small class of people who ask questions about whether the machine is working well and whether things should be moved around to make it work better. And to me, it's an incredible honor to be part of that small class of people who gets to ask those questions about how changing social arrangements might make society work better. And from my perspective, those types of questions are really writ large across the face of history. They're the questions that people have been asking for thousands of years, and that people will go on asking as long as mankind doesn't manage to wipe itself off the face of the earth. You might think that economic ideas are just abstract ideas that never change policy. And to some extent, maybe that's true. But to me, there are so many politicians and so many activists who believe they know how to make the world better, but who've really never taken the time to reflect on the contradictions in their own views. And as an economist, just the joy of seeing a logically consistent way that you could actually make the world better is quite beautiful in and of itself. And in the longer term, I'm not sure how useless those ideas are. If you think of John Maynard Keynes, if he had gone and spent all of his time trying to persuade Roosevelt to deficit spend, maybe he would have accomplished a little bit, but probably not very much. And World War II came along anyways. And in the long term, he changed how all governments in the world work. And now things that you just take for granted, that you think are so practical, like of course the government should spend during a recession, were totally crazy at the time that he was proposing them. So Keynes famously said that, practical men who think that they're just going on what common sense says are usually the slave of some economist who died 100 years ago. And on the other hand, the radical rabble-rouser who hears voices in the air to lead to a revolution is probably also listening to an economist who had a debate with that other economist 100 years ago. If you think of Athens, and you went to someone in Athens, they would have said, what are the most important, you ask them, what are the most important things going on? And they're like, well, Pericles just handed over the generalship to this other person whose name we don't even know anymore. And that was a really big coup. And you would have said, well, what about this guy who's walking around all the markets asking people questions about, morality and life and education? And they would have said, well, everybody's got their entertainers and crazy, academics, but those people really don't have much say on anything. And 2,000 years later, Socrates is the foundation of the civilization we all live in, and you only learn about Pericles once you come and take an ancient history course at the University of Chicago. So ideas have a long gestation period, but in the end, I think in the long term, very little matters. And I think democracy is a perfect example of that. Something that seemed like a completely crazy form of government 400 years ago is now completely axiomatic that, of course, that's the only way we can run anything, and anything else that you suggest is completely crazy and subversive. So I hope that you guys will consider engaging seriously with the life of the mind, even if you don't end up becoming economists or anything like that. So, thank you.